Dorothy Simpson had been noticing strangeness in her husband's behavior for some time now. It was mainly manifested in the fact that Robert deliberately avoided spending time with her and started staying late at work. Nevertheless, the man always managed to find a logical explanation for his absence. He always had to attend some meeting with the investors, or needed to sign a deal of the century, or wanted to organize a corporate party for his employees. Of course, Dorothy tried to support her husband in everything. After all, they'd been living together in perfect harmony for over 20 years. It feels stupid to distrust your husband when you're well over 40, Dorothy thought, looking at her reflection in the mirror. She had long come to terms with the fact that she was getting older, so she tried not to get upset about the new wrinkles in the corners of her eyes. Lately, Dorothy had been spending most of her time at home, doing chores, and rarely went out into the city. And if she did go out, it was only to buy groceries or to see her best friend, Catherine. Most of the time, they met in a quiet and cozy cafe downtown. They exchanged news and talked about everything in the world, enjoying each other's company and having a great time together. That's how it was that day when Catherine suggested that they should meet. Dorothy wanted to unwind and distract herself from her sad thoughts, so she gladly accepted Catherine's invitation. The friends ordered coffee and some pastry and started bringing each other up to date on their lives. Catherine was the one to speak most of the time, while Dorothy listened attentively to her friend. However, the woman didn't gossip, but simply discussed all sorts of things. At some point, Catherine's story came to a pause, which Dorothy immediately took advantage of. "My husband Robert is going on a business trip tomorrow. He says that it's a work thing. They're going to open a new branch in Boston." At the mention of her friend's husband, Catherine frowned and barely managed to suppress the desire to voice her disapproval. Nevertheless, the woman's face made it obvious that she knew something rather unpleasant about Robert. Then, unable to keep such important information to herself, she said, "I saw your husband with some woman the other day. They were having a conversation, and it seemed rather intimate, as if they were in a relationship." Dorothy's face immediately showed concern, which didn't go unnoticed by her friend. But then, having pulled herself together, she casually said, "You're probably mistaken. Robert spends most of his days in the office. It's highly unlikely that he even had the time to meet up with anyone." However, her friend's seemingly calm voice wasn't enough to convince Catherine. She had already managed to get married and divorced 3 times, and was thus used to treating men with a fair amount of distrust. At the same time, Catherine easily got along with the representatives of the opposite sex and enjoyed getting attention from them. When the women were just about done with their meeting, Catherine got 2 men to join them at their table. They stopped by the cafe for a cup of coffee on their lunch break. Catherine quickly got the strangers engaged in the conversation, and just a minute later, she already knew their names, David and Kyle. Winking at her friend, she started flirting with the men, which they clearly enjoyed. But Dorothy had a slightly different take on the situation, and frankly felt rather uncomfortable. "I should probably go. Robert is leaving on his business trip tomorrow. I need to help him pack," the woman muttered and got up from the table. Catherine frowned, but didn't argue with her friend and saw her off. On her way home, Dorothy kept thinking about Robert. What else does he want? He's got a good job, a car, a big comfy house. Our daughter is all grown up, the woman thought to herself. Having returned home, she didn't find Robert there, of course. But she did find a note on the table which read that her husband had gone on a business trip a day early. Well, he was in such a hurry that he didn't even say goodbye, Dorothy thought sadly. At that moment, she sincerely regretted not having stayed at the cafe with Catherine. What Robert did upset Dorothy. She used to trust her husband and believed his every word. She spent the rest of the day haunted by her sad thoughts and memories of the past. As she lay down in her cold bed, Dorothy wished Robert good luck in her head and tried to go to sleep. but she only managed to fall asleep in the morning when it already started getting light outside. And 2 hours later, the phone rang. Dorothy picked up the phone, thinking that it was Robert calling to tell her that he safely arrived at his destination. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm a patrol officer. I'm sorry to inform you that your husband died in an accident," said the man on the phone. At first, Dorothy decided that she didn't hear him right and that her tired mind was playing tricks on her. But when the police officer said it again, the woman realized that it was true. As it turned out, Robert was in a hurry to get to his meeting and went over the speed limit. He lost control of his car and crashed into a traffic barrier on the bridge. The car caught fire on impact and the driver died on the spot. The fire was so strong that by the time the rescuers arrived, Robert's Ford had burned down completely. The officers never managed to figure out the exact cause of the fire. Unfortunately, Robert's body burnt down completely, and all that remained was his belt buckle and a couple of metal buttons. Dorothy could barely remember the funeral and the wake. She felt as if she was stuck in a nightmare, and if it weren't for the help of her daughter and friend, she definitely wouldn't have been able to handle the load that fell on her fragile shoulders. Robert's funeral was held with a closed coffin in which his personal belongings were placed. If only I didn't let him go on that trip. It would all be different now, Dorothy reproached herself. For some reason, the woman felt that she was to blame for her husband's death. It's hard to say what would have happened if Dorothy had continued to torture herself with such sad thoughts. Most likely, she would have ended up having a mental breakdown or even a heart attack. Fortunately, Catherine got involved in time, and a couple of months later, she finally managed to pull her friend out of the abyss of depression. Stop torturing yourself with those sad thoughts. You need a change of scenery. Maybe try getting a job. "Do you want me to put in a good word for you at my office?" Catherine asked. Dorothy smiled and shook her head in response. "No, I don't want to work with a lot of people. I'd rather look for something else." Catherine patted her friend on the shoulder approvingly and praised her for making the right choice. The next day, Dorothy started looking for a job as promised. However, finding the right option turned out to be a rather difficult task. Dorothy wasn't young anymore, so she didn't meet the age requirements of many of the job openings. But when the woman saw the job ad for the position of a maid, she immediately realized that it was her chance. Having arrived at the address, Dorothy found herself at the door of a huge 3-story mansion. Wow, they must be very rich, the woman thought to herself. There was a beautiful garden, which took up almost all the space around the house. Soon, the door of the house opened, and the owner greeted Dorothy. She was a well-groomed woman in her 60s who looked very elegant. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I called you about the job posting," Dorothy said. "Yes, I remember. You wanted to be my maid. My name is Lois Morris. You can call me Lois," the woman said in an authoritative voice. Dorothy didn't say anything in response and simply nodded. Lois asked her a couple of questions customary in such situations and then hired her on the spot. Judging by the situation and the expensive interior of the house, the woman had enough money to be able to afford anything she wanted. Having gotten the job, Dorothy gladly got to it. Dorothy spent her day cleaning the house and mopping the floors, and when it was time to go home in the evening, Lois was pleased with her work. But when the new maid went outside, she nearly bumped into a man who was about to enter the house. Dorothy looked up and nearly fainted from what she saw. Standing in front of the astonished woman was no one else but her own late husband, Robert. Dorothy was so shocked that she couldn't speak for a moment. "Dorothy, what are you doing here?" Robert exclaimed indignantly. "Are you serious? How dare you ask me that? I buried you in a closed coffin and was mourning your death all this time," Dorothy answered with tears in her eyes. His ex-wife's words made Robert feel uncomfortable. He turned pale and didn't know what to say. At that very moment, the door of the house opened and Lois Morris stepped outside. "Honey, why are you so late? Did you have a lot of work?" she asked Robert in a rather unctuous voice. Dorothy looked at her ex-husband and understood everything without words. It was obvious that Robert and Lois were in a relationship. As it turned out a little later, it was Lois who helped Robert stage his death. Having unlimited funds, the woman hired the best stuntmen and pyrotechnicians who set everything up. Robert's plan was ingeniously simple. Unwilling to go through the divorce procedures with his wife Dorothy, he decided to simply disappear and start a new life with a rich widow. Robert's only mistake was to suggest that Lois hired a new maid and take the place of the elderly woman who used to work for Lois. The man had no way of knowing that it would be his ex-wife who'd get hired for this position. He'd been successfully avoiding her for several years. By and large, Robert was too big of a coward to be honest with his wife and tell her that he hadn't been in love with her for a long time. But now, looking his ex-wife in the eyes, the man realized that there was no turning back. Meanwhile, Dorothy wished Robert and his new wife a happy life together and headed home. In the depths of her soul, the woman felt a previously unknown feeling of lightness and elation. Dorothy realized that there was no turning back. Her old life was gone, and it was time to take care of herself. Of course, she didn't turn Robert in to the police. Instead, Dorothy erased her ex-husband from her memory, and like her friend Catherine, finally started putting herself first. At 45, I feel like my life is just starting, Dorothy thought, getting ready for a date and blowing a kiss at her reflection in the mirror. There were so many interesting things waiting for Dorothy in this life that she no longer felt she could afford to waste a single minute feeling sad.